When it comes to cases of mysterious deaths and the conspiracy theories that surround that mystery, there are a few more popular than the Dyatlov Pass incident. Taking place in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union in early 1959, the Dyatlov Pass incident is a case involving the mysterious deaths of 9 hikers. Although the Ural Mountains are known to be rather strenuous to hike, the entire group, led by a man named Igor Dyatlov, was well experienced in trekking, but the Urals had become especially brutal that particular winter, which made them a grade 3 hiking difficulty. In the present, hikes are typically graded from 1 to 5, with 1 being very easy and 5 being highly advanced. And at the time of the incident, grade 3 was the highest difficulty a trek could be rated in the Soviet Union and most countries. On February 1st, 1959, only 10 days after the trip began, the group set up camp on a slope to rest for the night. But sometime that evening, all 9 members of the expedition fled from the tent into the freezing and cruel Siberian night. Nearly 3 weeks after the group failed to return from their trek, a search party was organized to find them. This rescue team found the group's tent, but could not find the hikers. Eventually, the hikers' remains were discovered, and the bodies were scattered, with some lying solitary in the snow, and others huddled together in a ravine. Now, when the bodies were discovered, the search team was fascinated by the attire of the remains. Well, the attire of the remains, what they were wearing, because all of the bodies were very underdressed, with nearly every hiker was missing shoes despite the sub-zero mountain temperatures. Now, when the bodies were recovered and brought back for an autopsy, and that autopsy was performed, the results from the autopsy brought even more questions than it did answers. 6 of the hikers, of course, just succumbed to hypothermia, but the other 3 suffered severe blunt force trauma, including a fractured skull. To add to the mystery of that, one of the hikers was actually missing their tongue too. Then, when the hikers' clothes were inspected, a few pieces of clothing were found to be abnormally radioactive. Now, as the investigation continued, the mountain where the bodies were discovered was roped off and became a restricted access zone for the following 3 years. And when the original autopsy results were released, it was concluded that all the hikers had died to a, quote, unknown compelling force. Obviously, this explanation is rather ambiguous and is a large part of the reason why this mystery became involved with multiple conspiracy theories. Now, obviously, an unknown compelling force could be anything from something mundane like an avalanche, or something extraordinary like a possible UFO encounter, or even an altercation with a mythical creature. The only certain thing that came from this story was that 9 young adults, with their whole lives in front of them, inexplicably and mysteriously lost their lives in the Ural Mountains. Today, as we take a closer look at the specifics of this case, I will try my best to explain what actually happened on the Dyatlov expedition, and even perhaps what led to their eventual demise. Also, throughout the story, you might wonder how we know so much about the group's actions before their deaths, and the reason we do know as much as we do is that the group kept a communal diary between themselves, and also kept some private diaries. And on top of that, some members of the group actually had cameras, which is where we get a majority of the images that I'll probably throw out throughout this video. And a lot of those images are what are very synonymous with this case. On January 23rd, 1959, 9 hikers, all students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk, were preparing for a trek into the Ural Mountains, which I should just get this out of the way now. There's going to be a lot of Russian names in this, and there's going to be a lot of Russian cities in this. I'm going to try my best to pronounce them, but they're probably going to be pretty god-awful, so just a fair warning. To fully understand the diversity of this group, we're going to cover all of them pretty quickly, but this will mostly just serve as like a short or quick overview, and obviously we'll learn more about the group members as we go through this story. The leader of the expedition was a 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov. Igor was quite popular at the university and was especially well known for his proficiency in hiking and trekking. Additionally, later testimonies claimed that Igor was a natural-born leader and could handle even the most difficult situations thrown at him. During his time at the Institute, Igor was studying radio engineering because he was both skilled and knowledgeable when it came to radio-based technology, and even had access to a shortwave radio in his home, even though these were rather rare due to the ongoing Cold War at the time. Igor had actually created or crafted a radio receiver that could be used during hikes like this. However, this device was both heavy and clunky, and considering the group had to pack the largest amount of essentials, bringing the receiver along would be both impossible and not really a necessity. Igor and all the other members we'll talk about in a second that were in the party were grade 2 certified hikers. This expedition into the Ural Mountains was actually supposed to serve as their final certification to become grade 3. And if they received this certification, they would all be eligible to teach others about the sport of mountain trekking. Zenaida K., who was 22 years old at the time, was one of the only 2 women in the Ural Mountains hiking crew. Zenaida was also studying radio engineering, but was far less advanced than Igor was. Zena, as her friends called her, was said to be the type of person who would light up an entire room when she was present. At 20 years old, Ludia was the only other woman in the expedition. Due to her study in economics, she was appointed the duty of gathering the group's money and sorting it for the trek. Additionally, she was known more as a rather serious individual and was not known to really lose her cool very often. As a testament to that point, on a previous hiking trip with a different group, Ludia was accidentally shot in the leg by another hiker, but despite that, and the fact that she had to be escorted 50 miles down the mountain to receive medical care, she never lost her composure and kept the group's morale up the entire time. Yuri Yudin, a 21-year-old geology student, was known to be pretty easygoing with a good sense of humor. Interestingly, Yuri had intense health issues ever since he was a child, most notably suffering from rheumatism and chronic knee and back pain. But despite this, Yuri still had a fondness for hiking and was also grade 2 registered. Yuri Doroshenko, or just Doroshenko as I'll refer to him in this video, was a 21-year-old radio engineering student alongside Igor and Zena. Previously, he and Zena had actually been in a relationship, but they were already separated at the time of the trek. Doroshenko, in a way, was sort of the muscle of the group, if I had to say. He was the tallest in the group, and was known in the school for once chasing off a bear on a previous camping trip while using a hammer, which, is about the most stereotypical Russian story imaginable, and it's incredible. 23-year-old Georgy, or Yuri to his friends, was a construction and hydraulics student at the university and was good friends with Igor. Georgy was kind of the stereotypical funny guy in the group, and was known to either always be cracking jokes or playing his mandolin and singing songs. Alexander Kolevatov was a 24-year-old nuclear physics student and was an extraordinarily private individual and was usually very reluctant to share much information about his personal life. Rustic, who was 23, was the rich kid of the group and had already earned a degree in mechanical engineering, and both of his parents were university professors. Now, despite his and his family's wealth, Rustic was not one to really brag about it, and similar to Georgy, he too enjoyed playing the mandolin and cracking jokes. 23-year-old Kolya had already earned a degree in construction, and he was known to be very intelligent and very popular at UPI. Additionally, he was an avid hiker who tried to find humor in any situation. Now, once all the members of the group were packed and prepared for the trip, they made their way to the tram station that would deliver them to the nearby train station. Once aboard the train, they noticed that they had gained an extra member. A man named Simeon, or Sasha as he preferred to be called for some reason, had joined the expedition. Sasha, who was by far the oldest member of the group, was 38 years old, but he was a hiking instructor and was good friends with Igor because of that. Upon first glimpse, the other group members noted some oddities about Sasha's appearance. Most notably, they noticed that he had a few golden teeth and several tattoos on his arm. Now, during the time of this story, tattoos were pretty rare unless you had served in military, and actually, Sasha did serve military. If Igor trusted Sasha, the rest of them had no reason not to trust him, so the group welcomed him in, bringing the group count to 10 members. On the morning of January 24th, 1959, the group arrived in a material mining town known as Serov. Serov was merely a resting point where the group was meant to catch a separate train to the town of Ivdel. However, they reached Serov early in the morning, and the next train to Ivdel wasn't set to depart until that evening. Now, at first, the group planned to catch some rest in the train station, but the workers denied them re-entry until their train arrived later in the day. Now, in an attempt to bring some sort of levity to the group, Georgi began playing his mandolin and singing loudly on the train's platform. In addition to the disgusted and confused look he got from the rather unwelcoming citizens of Serov, Georgi also caught the attention of a nearby police officer, and the officer quickly detained Georgi and reminded him that disturbing other passengers was illegal. Luckily, most likely because of his age, Georgi was let off with just a warning. After this, the group made their way to a nearby elementary school and knocked on the door. When they knocked, they were greeted by a cleaning lady and the schoolmaster. Once the group explained the situation they were in to the schoolmaster, he let them inside to rest until the next train arrived. Now, the schoolmaster actually invited the Dyatlov group to give a lecture on hiking to his students, and they eagerly agreed. They discussed equipment, tent setup, safe hiking practices, and all of this captivated the children. It captivated them so much that the kids pretty much became fond of the group, and some even started asking if they could come along for the journey and wanted to join the group and stuff like that. And before leaving, they sang with the children and then bid them farewell. And when boarding the train at 6:30 to Ivdel, little did those children know they were among the last to see the Dyatlov group alive. The group arrived in Ivdel in the early hours of January 25th, 1959. Luckily this time, the workers at the Ivdel station were much kinder than those at the Serov station and allowed the group to sleep in the station until dawn broke. Once the sun rose, the group explored the town and were constantly checking their packs to make sure they had every necessity they needed for the journey. Now, Ivdel was as far as they could ride on train. To reach the town of Vizhay, they would need to catch a bus, and they did end up catching a bus. And specifically, they caught a GZA 651, which was a mass-produced Soviet Union public vehicle. It was like a bus, basically. Now, even though it is a bus and it was a rather large vehicle, the already 10 members of the Dyatlov group had to share the space with another hiking group which was led by a name, good lord, it was led by a man named Yuri Blinov, who was good friends with Igor. Interestingly, and somewhat coincidentally, Blinov's group was also heading to Vizhay. However, their group would be hiking a different trail once they reached Vizhay. So now, with two hiking groups in the bus, they also had to share the bus with locals looking for a ride to Vizhay because that was where they were from. So this obviously made the bus rather cramped, but everyone still seemed in pretty high spirits. Now, the bus ride from Ivdel to Vizhay took an average of 2 hours with pretty infrequent stops for bathroom breaks. However, there was a shop, there was a shop stop along the route that allowed all passengers to have a longer period to relieve themselves and prepare for the remainder of the ride. But once the bus was back on the road, Igor and some others noticed they were lacking a party member. Specifically, it was Alexander, and Alexander had failed to make it back to the bus before it departed, which all group members were pretty shocked to learn. And, earlier I said, he was a rather serious person, but in addition to that, he was also known to be a rather, poignant person, and to almost an obsessive degree. He was always on time. But they also knew Alexander wouldn't accept defeat, and although the bus driver refused to turn around to go get him, he did agree to stop briefly if Alexander, for some reason, decided to pursue the bus on foot. And sure enough, after a few minutes, Alexander was seen sprinting towards the bus, and when he got back on, the group noted that he had a genuine look of fear in his eyes, because he thought he was being abandoned on this very important trip for all of them. So the bus arrived in Vizhay around 2 p.m. and according to the group in their journal, Vizhay was a pretty decent-sized town that was inhabited mostly by free workers. Now, free workers are basically just one step above slaves, because whereas slaves work for no money, free workers work for very little money. When the bus arrived in Vizhay, the group knew they had to go their separate ways from Blinov's group. So both groups decided to spend that day celebrating and enjoying lunch together at a local cafeteria. And after this, the Blinov group set off for their destination, not knowing this would be the last time they saw the Dyatlov group alive. Now, while the Blinov expedition set off that day, the Dyatlov expedition wasn't really set to begin until the next morning, which meant the group had to find some sort of lodging or housing for the night. Luckily for them, one of the directors at the local free workers camp took a liking to the group and offered them housing in one of the camp's guest houses. According to Yuri Yudin, the house was pretty large and was much nicer than anything that they were used to using. And that night, the group once again checked their packs, they ate dinner, and a few even went to a local cinema in the town to watch a movie. Then on January 26th, the group once again went over their items and had breakfast. That afternoon, the group was supposed to catch a truck that would take them to Sector 41 of the Ural Mountains, where their hike would truly begin. However, as a precaution, the group met the local forester that morning to get an understanding of the condition of the Ural Mountains. The forester warned the group that the conditions of the mountain were perilous, to say the least. Now, the intended route was already hazardous, but it kind of became even worse in winter because obviously there's the snow, there's the ice, but also the snow and ice hide some deep ravines in the Ural Mountains. And if you were to fall in one of these ravines, well, I mean, they had smaller ravines and stuff, but they had some big ones too. Like, if you fell in them, you would certainly die. I mean, if the fall didn't kill you, there would be no way to get you out. So, yeah, not the greatest conditions going on the mountain. To make that even worse, the Ural Mountains are pretty notorious for their high winds, but those winds get even worse during winter. So basically, the forester told them there couldn't be a worse time to go to the mountain. But despite that, the group was pretty much unfazed by the news. They knew the risks of the journey, and those risks were honestly the reason they were even there. If they completed this hike, they would be among the best explorers to ever live in the Soviet Union. To them, it was, no matter what, we are hiking that mountain. Later that afternoon, the group crowded into the back of a truck, which was another GZA class vehicle. But unlike the previous bus they used, this was a truck, which means it offered... They were riding in the back of this truck, so they had no protection from the cold. And all 10 of them just had to sit in the back of this truck in the freezing Siberian winter. Now, most of them were adequately layered against the cold. Well, I shouldn't even say adequately. They were very well, protected against the cold. They were completely layered, but still, these are brutal temperatures. But no matter how much layering they did, there was one member who started to feel pretty uncomfortable in the situation, and that was Yuri Yudin. Now, despite his precautions to avoid the exact thing we're about to talk about, Yuri noticed the winter air had begun sort of intensifying his pain from his rheumatism and also his joint pain. Still, he told the group he would be good enough for the hike and that they had no reason to worry about him. The group arrived in Sector 41 about 3 hours after leaving Vizhay. Sector 41, as you could probably assume by its name, was not a traditional or conventional village like the previous three we've talked about. Instead, it was a pure working camp. Specifically, it was a woodcutting camp. There was no, entertainment. They weren't going to be able to catch a movie here. It was just an entire work camp. Still, like most places this group has visited so far, they were greeted by a generous group of people who gladly accommodated them before they set off. The group and most of the woodcutting crew ate dinner together that night, sang songs, and celebrated the journey this group would face. On the morning of January 27th, Yuri Yudin woke up in extreme pain. But still, he decided he wanted to push through this journey, so the group's next stop was an abandoned village. Now, luckily, a worker at the camp had access to a sled and was heading to the abandoned village to collect some supplies, meaning the group could stow their packs on his sled, which, even though they could stow their packs on his sled, they would still have to make the journey on foot. They would make the journey on foot. So basically, they could take some weight off their shoulders to make this journey somewhat easier while he takes their stuff to the abandoned village they're going to. Now, the village laid about 15 miles north of Sector 41, but this was pretty much nothing for this group. They had done hikes like this a million times at this point. To kind of expand on that, they would have to also trek through the night to stay on schedule, but still, their spirits were incredibly high. Along the way, they took numerous photos, and the thing to get the level 3 hiking grade, they had to document pieces of their journey and their hike. So a lot of the pictures they took were more on serious sides of them just hiking and like pictures of their camps and stuff. But also in the middle of those and among all those, you would find pictures of just clearly a group of friends having fun on a journey. They arrived at this abandoned village in the dead of the night, and only one of the houses in this abandoned village was in a state to actually live in for even a night. So all of them piled into that house. The women of the group took the available beds in the house, and all the men, including the sled driver, hunkered down in the living room with their sleeping bags. Yuri Yudin once again went to bed with excruciating pain running down his spine and legs, but regardless, he hoped that the pain would go away after getting some rest, but unfortunately, he wasn't so lucky. The next morning, Yuri struggled to even get up. And it was at that point that him and everyone in the group realized that he was not going to be able to continue the journey. Now, since the abandoned village was the last shelter besides a tent, and the sled driver was still present, it was decided Yuri would return to Sector 41. Though he was rather regretful and sad about this decision, he understood it and knew it was the smartest decision. But before leaving, Igor told Yuri that the trek might end up exceeding the estimated return date of February 13th, but they would make sure to send a telegram to UPI once they returned to Vizhai. With that, the group bid farewell to Yuri, and sadly, this would be the last time Yuri would see any of his friends alive. Now, no one was too concerned when February 13th, 1959 came and went. When groups embarked on treks like these, it wasn't very uncommon for them to exceed their expected return dates by a few days. Additionally, if you remember, Igor told Yuri that he was almost certain the group would not make the return date of the 13th. But around the 16th or 17th, some concerns started to set in when the group still had yet to return or contact their friends, family, or the school. Now, UPI was still under the impression that the group was likely delayed or had simply forgotten to send a telegram when they returned to Vizhai, but due to the parents' insistence, the Institute sent a telegram to Vizhai asking if anyone had seen the Dyatlov group return. Now, the parents' concerns were justified when on February 18th, 1959, Vizhai informed UPI that the Dyatlov group had not returned from the mountain. This prompted UPI to organize a search party comprising of faculty and students of the school, other hiking groups such as Blinov's group, and Russian police and military personnel were all part of the search. And the official search for the Dyatlov expedition commenced on February 20th, 1959. Lev Gordo, who was the director of UPI's mountaineering club, and Yuri Blinov were to board a military helicopter to scan the mountain from the air in an attempt to find any evidence or possibly spot the group's tent. For the first couple of days, there were no leads in the search for the group. In a desperate attempt to learn anything about the group's whereabouts, Blinov and Gordo traveled to a Manzi encampment to ask some questions. Now, the Manzi are a peaceful, somewhat nomadic group of people who are native to Siberia. Typically, they're like reindeer herders and handlers, and are especially proficient at hunting and fishing. The village the men entered was named Bahityrova. The tribesmen there told the men that they had seen the group and even offered them shelter for the night. The group, however, only stopped at the village for a moment and denied the offer, then set off soon after. Also, the Dyatlov group did have a planned route in the Ural Mountains, but there was a bit of a crucial oversight. Igor Dyatlov was the only person in the world that had a copy of the expedition plan. For some reason, they had not submitted this route to the hiking committee or shared any of the maps with their friends or family, which, basically left the search party with no choice but to conduct a blind investigation across the vast Ural Mountains, hoping to uncover any small shred of evidence or clue. Also, if you're curious about why they didn't ask Yuri, who had at this point already returned to UPI, it seems like hardly anyone was even aware that he returned, and he was positive the group would return soon. As the search continued with nothing turning up, the party grew increasingly desperate for information about the route to narrow down their investigation area. They turned to a man named Yevgeny Maslinikov, who was the man who had approved Dyatlov's route. Yevgeny was a respected UPI alumnus and was an experienced mountaineer who often spoke at hiking clubs in the Ural region. He was very surprised by the group's failure to return, because he had actually hiked this same route that they were planning to take, and he believed that all of these people, all of the members of the Dyatlov group, were more than qualified for it. He did emphasize the difficulty of the terrain and warned that if the group did happen to get lost on the mountain, it would be a very critical situation. And later, he would end up joining the search party to aid in the efforts. On February 23rd, the Manzi tribe of Bahityrova joined the search as well, and with the addition of the Manzi, the search party gained confidence the group would eventually be found. The Manzi knew the Urals better than anyone and were especially skilled trackers, and even though the search party was confident they'd find the group, the public perception, well, even the private perception, the search party started to have this shift in an idea that this was becoming more of a recovery mission than a rescue mission. On February 24th, the search intensified with new waves of students, teachers, mountaineers, authority figures, and anyone who could aid in the search joined the effort. That day, a helicopter spotted ski tracks on the bank of the Ospia River in the mountains, and another Manzi tribe reported seeing tracks and evidence of camping about 50 miles out from the village. Unfortunately, these leads still turned up nothing by the next day. The party continued tracking ski marks along the river on February 25th, discovering several campsites along the way. Confident in their direction, they camped for the night, planning to resume tracking at dawn. However, harsh weather conditions erased the ski tracks, leaving them with no choice but to follow the river, but they were hoping that the Dyatlov group had actually done the same thing. A member who later left due to health reasons advised following the river to Otorten Mountain, which was actually supposed to be the group's final destination and was supposed to be where they began hiking back. Interestingly, when he left, he also warned the search party that there was likely an increased avalanche risk at this time because there was a lot of recent snowfall, and the wind conditions, like I said earlier, were pretty awful during these times. During the hike, the group split into pairs to cover more ground. There was a leader named Boris Slobstov and a hiking student, Mikhail Ravine, who ascended a nearby mountain to gain a better view of the area. Before reaching the summit, Mikhail spotted something about 75 yards off to their left. After kind of just staring at whatever this thing was, they eventually realized that it was some sort of black material, which when they got to it, when they went to inspect this sort of black material, they found it was actually a part of the tent, which matched the description of the one the Dyatlov group had brought with them. The tent was eventually found on Holochal Mountain, which in Manzi means dead mountain. Now, while that name is rather foreboding and somewhat coincidental to this story, there was a reason they referred to it as this, and that was because it was pretty much vacant of wildlife and like plants, like flora. Now, they were initially very confused by this scene, because of course they were, because at first the pair noticed that there was not a single member of the expedition inside the tent. Besides that, they also noticed that the tent was in a severe state of disrepair. It was partially destroyed and was covered with a small layer of snow. When they looked inside, they got even more confused, because at the time it was -6 degrees Fahrenheit on the mountain, and when they looked inside, every member's shoes were just laying on the ground. Also, most of their supplies were completely untouched. Now, after reuniting with the other members of the search party, they descended the mountain to share their discovery. When they reached the makeshift camp that was made by the search party, they sent out a telegram to inform everyone of the find. The following morning, on February 27th, the mountain was swarmed with search party members eager to uncover any sort of answers. However, this eagerness proved detrimental to the effort, as there was no shred of organization for anybody on the mountain, which basically caused the scene, what can only be described as a crime scene around this tent, to become heavily contaminated. Professional investigators, including policemen who had canine units, were en route, but the impatience by the search party and the eagerness to find anything pretty much led some of these individuals to just act irrationally and possibly destroy evidence. Also, when the investigators did eventually arrive, they found it challenging to find any solid tracks from the hikers, and part of that was due to the snow and the wind covering up some of their footprints and ski tracks, but also it was because there was just this horde of people now stomping all over every bit of evidence around. Luckily, they were able to find some undisturbed tracks along the larger perimeter of the site, and these tracks were pretty important for several reasons. Firstly, they indicated that all 9 hikers left the tent at the same time. At once, every single one of them left the tent. Secondly, some tracks suggested that multiple group members were barefoot or only wearing socks, which of course correlates with the shoes that were left in the tent. After about 500 yards or so, the tracks disappeared in the snow, but despite this, the investigators chose to follow the direction the tracks were leading to see if it ended up with anything. This method brought them to the forest's edge, where they uncovered remnants of what appeared to be a sort of poorly constructed campfire. When they looked a little bit closer at the campfire, they noticed right next to it, and buried beneath a layer of snow, there was the first 2 bodies of the ill-fated expedition, which was now nearly a mile away from the tent. Those bodies were identified as Georgy and Yuri Doroshenko. They were found lying side by side, dressed in little more than underwear. Georgy's body was positioned face up, with parts of soft tissue missing from his face, likely due to scavenging by birds or other animals post-mortem. Doroshenko's body, who was lying face down, appeared almost as if he were sleeping, with his head resting on his folded arms. Additionally, several broken tree branches were found beneath Doroshenko's body. Later information mentioned that a nearby Siberian cedar was missing branches near the bottom of the tree, which meant most likely Doroshenko, or possibly another hiker, attempted to climb this tree. The reason why they attempted this is pretty unknown. A few hours later, about 330 yards away from the first 2 bodies, the search party finds another set of remains. This body was face up and was slightly better dressed than the previous 2, but was also without shoes or any form of hand protection like gloves or anything. Later, this body would be confirmed to be that of Igor Dyatlov, the expedition's leader. On February 27th, the 4th body was discovered. which was smaller in size, which meant that it was more than likely a female. This victim was Zenaida, and she was found to be the best dressed among those discovered thus far, although she also was still without shoes. Her body was positioned on its left side, almost in like a climbing position, with her face partially covered in blood upon closer inspection. On March 1st, now 2 days without finding any additional hikers, it was becoming painfully obvious that this was now a recovery mission. Now, while the search parties continued to comb the surrounding area, investigators looked at the tent and the location of the first two bodies to get a better understanding of what may have happened. The investigators initially examined the makeshift campsite where Georgi and Doroshenko's bodies were found. They predicted that the campfire had only burned for about 2 hours, but there were branches nearby gathered. They found branches nearby that seemed to have been gathered as if they were going to be used to sustain the fire, but they were completely unused. Additionally, they observed unknown footprints near the fire, which meant that there was likely another hiker who was present with the two, who may have left after they passed away. Now, also, like I said a minute ago, there was a nearby tree that lacked lower branches, and because of the branches found under Doroshenko, along with minor bruises and scratches he had on his body, it's presumed he attempted to climb the tree, although why exactly he did it still remained unclear. Then the investigators turned towards the tent. Nevertheless, the investigators acknowledged that the tent's placement on the slope seemed purposeful, indicating the group had knowledge of setting up a tent on slope. As they searched the tent, there started to be some initial theories that came to the surface. First, they discovered traces of urine outside the tent. This led them to speculate that maybe one of the hikers, while using the restroom outside, got frightened by something. He panicked and called out to his friends inside. And once he called out to them, it triggered all of them to panic, and they ran out of the tent. However, certain details like the hikers being underdressed and underprepared remained very confusing. To address this, the investigators suggested that the group may have been having dinner, in which case they would have shed some of their layers while inside the tent, because if they're in a snowy condition, their layers are going to get wet. So it wasn't uncommon for them to go in the tent and then shed some of their layers when they're hanging out inside. So that's what they started to assume, is that maybe they were in there drying off, and then the one outside panicked, which made all of them panic, and then eventually led to the chaotic evacuation of the tent. On March 2nd, now with more time to kind of contemplate the evidence, another more outlandish theory started to emerge. In a telegram to Ivdel, one investigator asked if there was a possible meteorological rocket launched on February 1st, which was becoming the presumed date of the incident where they all left the tent. Now, while it might seem a little random, this idea actually stemmed from reports of a meteorological probe launch observed in Ivdel and a nearby Manzi camp on that same day. Now, a few days after that telegram was sent, which we'll touch on later, a few days after that question was sent, on March 5th, the fifth body was discovered. Rustic's body was found halfway between where Igor and Zena's bodies were discovered. Now, he was covered in a thin layer of snow and ice. He laid face down, also in sort of this weird climbing position, very similar to Zena. Now, adding to the already strangeness of this case, investigators noticed that the bodies of Igor, Zena, and Rustic shared a rather peculiar sort of circumstance, because all three of them had their heads pointing towards the location of the tent. Now, at first, investigators kind of speculated that some hikers might have attempted to return to the tent after they all exited, but eventually succumbed to the elements. Now, Rustic's body was placed with the other four found earlier and awaited transport to Sverdlovsk for further examination. Additionally, preparations were made to collect the tent for inspection back in Ivdel. Now, the autopsies revealed that all 5 of these hikers died of hypothermia, which, while not the craziest assumption, they were all found frozen in the Siberian tundra. It kind of obviously prompted questions about why this experienced group ventured out underprepared and underdressed in sub-zero temperatures. As for the tent, further inspection discovered cuts through the fabric, possibly suggesting either an intruder or maybe even a member had cut their way through the tent. When the cuts in the tent were kind of examined more closely, something was discovered that started to catapult the story into infamy. Initially, some investigators thought that these cuts were just caused by natural phenomena, such as a slab avalanche cutting through the fabric. But this idea was quickly debunked as the cuts were deemed too precise, meaning that there had to be some human element to them. And secondly, it was determined that the cuts originated from inside the tent. The tent was equipped with 3 interior latches, but they were very easy to open in case of an emergency. What this means is that something or someone scared the group so bad that to the extent that they believed that literally cutting themselves out of the tent would be faster than opening the super easy to open entrance. This would also explain their lack of preparedness and their lack of apparel, as escaping would have been their primary concern in the face of some sort of immediate danger. Whatever pushed them out of the tent, they subsequently dispersed into the woods and eventually succumbed to the elements. And as we said, some of them seemed to even try to return to the tent, realizing they would need the gear to survive. Now, as the first autopsies kind of got underway, the authorities started kind of acting a little strange. Right after the autopsies, the families were approached by Russian authorities, requesting the allowance of them to bury all their loved ones in the Ural Mountains. Now, this raised several questions, because why would they want to bury all of them in the Ural Mountains? They just brought them off of the Ural Mountains, right? So they bring them off the Ural Mountains back into Sverdlovsk, because the autopsies were held in Sverdlovsk instead of Ivdel. Ivdel is where the tent was inspected. So the authorities get them off the mountain. They get their bodies off the mountain, fly them down to Sverdlovsk, and then they're like, what if we take all their bodies and go take them back up to the Ural Mountains and bury them there? And all the families are like, why would you do that when they're already here? And Sverdlovsk was the hometown of multiple of the hikers. So it was a very strange request. It was only made stranger when the authorities said that the plan was to just throw all of their bodies into like a mass grave and then just kind of plop a stone obelisk on top of their bodies as like a marker. Obviously, all of the parents said absolutely not, but the authorities wouldn't let up and continued to pressure them to accept the offer. And it was even weirder because the parents of the victims started talking to one another. So when they started telling each other about what their experiences was with the authorities, they started discovering that the authorities were giving all of the families like conflicting information. For example, some were told that like, oh yeah, you should let your kids be buried here because this other family wants their kids to be buried up in the Ural Mountains too. When in actuality, every single family had said no to the offer. So they were starting to act very strangely. Basically what they were doing was they were trying to like trick them and suggest them into agreeing with the plan by saying, oh yeah, the other families are on board with this. But then when the families started talking to each other, they went, no, we said no as well. And they were telling us that you said yes. So yeah, a lot of weird information going around. When they uncovered these lies, the families started confronting the authorities and were questioning, why are you being so weird about this? After that, it became pretty evident that the authorities were trying, for some reason, to suppress this incident and try to quickly close the investigation. Now, despite them trying to close this as quickly as possible, the families still stood firm in their, yeah, we're not sending them back up to the Urals. They're going to be buried here. So that forced the Russian authorities to have to compromise with the family. They said the bodies could be buried in Sverdlovsk, but each funeral had to be held on different days. Yuri Yudin, who, if you remember, was the expedition's only survivor, later suggested that this was a move by Russian authorities to lessen the impact of the 9 deaths in the Ural Mountains. In the second week of March 1959, the first 5 hikers were laid to rest. Despite efforts by Russian authorities to restrict attendance at their funerals, reportedly over 1,000 people gathered to pay their respects. Interestingly, some attendees observed individuals in the crowd who seemed to be observing the people in the crowds of the funeral rather than on the funeral itself. Later, these individuals were identified as KGB agents, who were much more distinguishable from the regular police presence in Russia. The KGB, also known as the CSS, was the Soviet Union's counterpart to the CIA and was widely feared, much like the CIA in the United States. At the funeral, besides the KGB's presence, concerns were raised about the appearance of the victims' bodies, who were noted to have a strange, unusually dark complexion with a dark purplish tinge to their body. This observation revived an earlier theory linked to a meteorological rocket launch in early February 1959. There were reports from other hiking groups in the area describing they described seeing strange lights in the sky, but they said that they did not resemble any sort of known meteorological devices, but they more appeared as like orbs of some sort of unknown origin. Additionally, a photograph found on one of the Dyatlov group's cameras further fueled speculation regarding this theory. Now, in total, there were 3 cameras that were recovered during the initial investigation and confirmed to belong to Igor, Rustic, and Georgy. Between all 3 of them, there was nearly 90 photographs in total, and like I said earlier, the majority depicted typical scenes of the expedition and landscapes, along with pictures of the group just enjoying their hike. But the final photograph taken by Georgy puzzled investigators and remains a mystery to this day and fuels a lot of conspiracy around this story as well. Now, the photo is both dark and blurry, which suggests at the time, I mean, this is a 1959 camera, it's already not the greatest, but this suggests that it was taken at nighttime. And along the left side of the frame of the picture, you can see what is a long streak of light with an octagonal sort of shape in the center. That octagon shape in the center is likely just a lens flare, but that streak of light extending out of the photo is what remains completely unexplained. Now, some just speculate that Georgy captured the trail of a rocket, while others obviously entertain the idea that maybe there was something unnatural happening in the Ural Mountains on that night. Either way, this photo just made it increasingly more apparent that there was far more to the story than people initially thought. The search for the remaining 4 hikers continued relentlessly throughout March and April, yet still yielded no results. He coming up here? Come on. Nope. I think someone's decided to join me. Yep, he's joined me. That's his favorite spot to hang out, by the way. Whenever I'm up here working on stuff, he likes to sit up here, opposite side, and just watch what I'm doing. Exhaustion among search parties grew, and morale plummeted as it became increasingly clear that finding the remaining hikers alive was going to be impossible. with some even just some. Sorry, I just looked at him in my camera. But some people were even like not sure that they were going to find these people at all. The perilous conditions on the mountain persisted and only got worse, which resulted in some of the search party members getting injured themselves. And then by May 1959, 3 months after the group had fled the tent, searchers were desperate for any clue that could lead them to locating the last 4 victims. On May 3rd, a Manzi searcher discovered branches in a shallow hole near the cedar tree where the first 2 bodies were found. Now, upon examination, it appeared the branches had been cut with a knife, and this finding prompted a thorough search of the surrounding area for additional evidence. Later that day, about 6 yards from that hole, an article of clothing was discovered in the snow, followed by several others throughout the day. Now, investigators were confused by the discovery because the clothes appeared to be discarded rather than used, and some were like shredded or cut in like a very like panicked like effort. Another set of clothing led the searchers to a nearby ravine where they could hear flowing water. And then on May 5th, 1959, the 6th body, badly decomposed due to melting snow and being submerged in the ravine's flowing water, was discovered. It was identified as male, and believing the remaining bodies were nearby, the last 3 bodies were found later that day, and each of them were all in various stages of decomposition. Ludia's body was the only one that was really identifiable, though sections had undergone significant decomposition because she too had contact with the water. Now, parts of the bodies that were not in contact with the water were a lot less decomposed since they were sitting in snow and ice, but time was of the essence because when they were removed from that ice, they were going to decompose very rapidly because that ice is the only thing that's keeping them somewhat frozen in time, kind of. But as soon as they're taken out of that, they are going to start decomposing quick. Knowing that these last 4 bodies could be the key to understanding what truly happened on that mountain, investigators collected the bodies, wrapped them up to protect them from the elements, and prepared them for extraction to Ivdel. Now, due to some complications and miscommunication, the bodies wouldn't be extracted until May 8th, which was 4 days after they were discovered. Of the final 4 found, Alexander was the first to receive an autopsy. As expected, he was underdressed and was lacking shoes, and his cause of death was quickly determined to be hypothermia, just like the 5 before him. Next, Sasha was examined, and it didn't take long to determine that he had suffered a fate worse than hypothermia. Firstly, and most obviously and horrifyingly, his eyeballs were missing. Secondly, Sasha, who was among the best dressed of the group found, was also without shoes. During the autopsy, when they removed some of his layers, they noticed severe damage and partial caving in on the right side of his torso. All in all, he had sustained 5 fractured ribs, which resulted in severe internal bleeding. Most disturbingly, it was concluded that Sasha was also alive when these injuries were sustained and likely survived for a short time after he experienced these. Kolya received his autopsy next, and quickly it was determined that he too hadn't died due to hypothermia. He had suffered intense trauma to the side of his head, resulting in multiple skull fractures and severe intracranial hemorrhaging, which is also just known as a brain bleed. The coroners believed that Kolya had also been alive when these injuries occurred. The last member of the doomed expedition to undergo an autopsy was Lyuda, and her injuries were the most disturbing and mysterious out of them all. She had intense and severe. You know what? Yep, I would use both of those for what happened to her. Intense and severe trauma to her torso, which resulted in intense internal hemorrhaging, and she had severe damage to her right heart ventricle. She too had her eyes missing, and most horrifyingly, her tongue was also missing. When the autopsies were completed, the coroners were unable to determine exactly what happened to these final 3 hikers. They only concluded that these hikers experienced a violent death. The families of these people obviously found this exceptionally vague and pretty unsatisfactory. And added to the distress, the authorities became even more adamant about keeping the case quiet, insisting that the final 4 funerals be restricted to family only. However, before the funerals, an investigator ordered that the bodies undergo a radiological examination. Over a week later, after the bodies had been buried, the results came in. Now, some of the clothes belonging to the hikers showed abnormal levels of radiation. Specifically, 2 articles of clothing were found to have substantially higher radiation levels, with one being twice the typical measurement of the time. Now, everyone and everything on Earth does emit a slight amount of radiation, but when radiation levels exceed those typical levels, it raises quite a few concerns. The radiologist who conducted the examination stated that these elevated levels were alarming and surpassed the radioactive contamination levels typically seen in individuals who work in nuclear facilities. Despite the unusual radiation readings, they did not affect the case's outcome, and on May 28th, 1959, the Dyatlov case was closed, and obviously the families of the victims were deeply upset because they felt they had been largely uninformed throughout the investigation, and were also surprised by, I've been abandoned, but they were also surprised by the abrupt closure of the case. For their part, Russian authorities publicly criticized the sportsmasters at UPI for allowing this tragedy to happen, and targeted anyone associated with the Dyatlov expedition. To add to the mystery, again, before the case was closed, investigators and coroners were asked about the cause of the death of the 3 hikers with the unusual injuries, and they responded saying that an unknown compelling force was responsible for the injuries and ultimately the death of the 3 hikers. Additionally, this unknown force was likely what forced the other 6 hikers to flee the tent. This explanation provided essentially no insight of what happened to this group, and coupled with the authorities' odd behavior and the near impossibility that this large group of capable individuals would make such a critical and fatal error, it turned this case into the significant piece of mysterious history as we know it today. Throughout the investigation, one of the few certainties investigators had was that the hikers did not survive the night of February 1st, 1959. Now, before we delve further into possible explanations and the numerous times this case has been reopened, it's essential that we backtrack to when Yuri Yudin departed from the group. We need to kind of understand what happened after his departure until the fateful night that claimed the lives of the 9 individuals. After Yuri departed from the group on January 28th, the remaining members resumed hiking along a frozen river that would eventually merge with the Ospia River, which would then lead them to Otorten Mountain. On January 29th, they continued along the river, and although I mentioned the river was frozen, it had only a thin layer of ice which could easily break under too much weight. The condition of the mountain and how cold it was, and with all the wind, an accidental plunge into the water would likely result in the death of one of the hikers. In their journals, the group reported seeing tracks in the snow of both people and reindeer, which meant that there was some Manzi activity in the area. Additionally, they noted that they saw some trees marked with Manzi symbols. Besides the presence of the Manzi, there was nothing particularly noteworthy that happened on January 29th. Now, on January 30th, their trek became significantly more challenging. The temperature dropped considerably and the wind intensified. Additionally, it began snowing again, which covered the Manzi tracks the group had been following to ease their hike. This change in conditions led to frustration among some members of the group. To that point, Zina had noted in her diary that Kolya and Ludia had gotten into an argument that afternoon over some of the campsite chores, and although they managed to resolve the argument, their interactions after this were pretty much marked by bitterness. Later that evening, there was a celebration because January 30th, 1959 marked Yuri Doroshenko's 21st birthday. However, Lydia, still upset about the earlier argument, secluded herself in the tent while her friends celebrated around a campfire. Nonetheless, it was mostly a night of togetherness and friendship among the group. This brings us to January 31st, 1959, the last date listed in any of the journal entries. Now, I know I said that the investigators believe that the group fled the camp on the night of February 1st, but if the last entry is the 31st of January, how did they know that the group survived until the morning of the 1st? Well, the group structured their journal by documenting the day's events the following morning. So for the journal entry of the 31st to exist, the group had to be alive on the morning of the 1st. And to that point, they could not have survived until the morning of the 2nd because there was no journal entry for the 1st. Igor noted that on the 31st, the weather continued to worsen. The temperature dropped further and the wind got even worse. But the group set off at around 10 a.m. and luckily soon found some more Monzi tracks. Unluckily, their next course of action was to travel uphill, and while the previously trodden path did provide some ease, it was not by much when going uphill. Around 4 p.m. on the night of the 31st, the entire group was exhausted and began searching for a place to set up camp. They chose the lower ground of the Ospio Valley because the snow was lighter there and the winds were less harsh. In the last entry of the group's diaries, Igor wrote about the discomfort of the mountain and the profound emptiness they felt while being out there. Now, while I said there are no journal entries for the 1st, because they didn't survive until the morning of the 2nd, there are some recovered photos from the cameras that were found and revealed a handful of images depicting the group's activities during that day. As is expected at this point, a few of these were snapshots of the group enjoying each other's company and generally having a good time, while others were just documenting the travels. One image you see shows Rustic wearing a jacket that appears to be shredded. However, it is likely that in an attempt to dry his layers quickly, he accidentally left this jacket too close to the fire or the group's compact stove, and it caught on fire. Now, the next course of action was to construct a cache to lighten the load of their packs for the uphill trek, and to have resources and supplies stored for their return hike. Now, the construction of this cache and shelter took all morning, meaning that as soon as it was finished, the group had to get back on track very quickly. From then on, the photos became a lot more serious, and these were where most of those ones came that just depicted their journey so they could have documentation when they returned. And one of those pictures that were taken that day would essentially become the image that everyone associates with this story. It's estimated that sunset occurred around 6 p.m. on the night of the 1st, and with the conditions continuing to worsen on the mountains, braving the outdoors that night was not possible in any way. So the group hunkered down on the eastern slope of a mountain, likely hoping to get some much needed rest for the next day's hike. From this point onward, everything is mere speculation. One of the few confirmed activities of the Dyatlov group on the night of the 1st is setting up the tent on the slope. For instance, the group's compact stove was never assembled in the tent. There could be several reasons for why this is, but nothing is certain. So that's why I'm saying everything is speculation, because we are about to do some heavy speculating. So just know that's where this is heading. So we can speculate that in the dead of the night, the hikers were startled by something or someone. While they feared what was happening outside their tent, leaving meant facing Siberia's harsh winter. However, either out of consideration or in a spur-of-the-moment decision, staying inside became unbearable. In a panic, members attempted to undo the latches of the tent, but in their hysteria, it was proving difficult, which made their only alternative to literally slice their way out of the tent. In their first two attempts, they failed to slice through enough of the tent to escape, but on their third attempt, they managed to create a large enough exit. So, in a hurry, every member of the group fled the tent and ran into the freezing night. The temperature that night plummeted to a brutal negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and every member of the group was underdressed for such conditions. In the chaos of the escape, the group quickly became separated, and in the pitch black darkness of the mountain, their vision was impaired, and the ever-intensifying wind made it difficult to hear each other unless they were only feet away from each other. So, as they reached the tree line about 300 yards away from the tent, three groups had likely formed. The first of these groups was Georgi and Doroshenko. Now, they found themselves the most separated from the rest of the group. Now, when they reached the tree line, they spotted a large cedar tree that seemed to offer some potential shelter and possibly firewood. Despite the challenging conditions, Doroshenko used all of his strength to climb the tree and began cutting away at the branches for firewood. The onset of hypothermia had already begun to weaken him, so he lost his balance and tumbled to the ground, landing on a heap of branches that he had likely been tossing down to Georgi. Now, the fall likely left him partially dazed or with the wind knocked out of him, so if he was somewhat incapacitated, the task of starting a fire fell to Georgi. Fortunately, Georgi had a spare set of matches and used the branches Doroshenko had gathered to start a fire. However, by the time the fire was lit, hypothermia had already set in. Georgi collapsed near the unconscious Doroshenko, and both men succumbed to the cold while unconscious. The next group was Lydia, Kolya, Sasha, and Klevetov. They were north of the first two, and found themselves in a frantic sprint throughout the woods. Eventually, they ran into one of the more shallow ravines, which immobilized all of the group members besides Klevetov. Now, he either slid down the ravine or accidentally landed on one of his fellow hiking mates, which broke his fall. Now, if you remember, Lydia, Kolya, and Sasha were the ones that had the intense injuries. So that meant Klevetov was the only able-bodied member, and he, at this point, likely enters a sort of fight or flight mode, and honestly opts to fight in an attempt to save his friends. So he climbed his way out of the ravine and spotted a light coming from the direction they had ran from, which was actually the fire Georgi and Doroshenko had built. However, by the time he reaches them, it's too late to save them. Nonetheless, Klevetov realizes their deaths may not be in vain if the clothes they're wearing can be used by those who still have a chance to survive. Unbeknownst to him, his own body has already begun succumbing to hypothermia as well. So he's unable to lift either of the two men to remove their clothes. He can't lift either of them because he's already starting to fall victim to hypothermia. So he has to take a more desperate measure and starts literally cutting away pieces of fabric and part of their clothes to gather anything for his friends that could possibly still live. In an effort to kind of show respect, he arranges his friends side by side before embarking on the journey back to his original group. Now, when he gets back to the ravine, the other three members are either near death or already dead. But likely he is very unaware of the extent of their injuries. And he probably couldn't even comprehend that they couldn't move. Of all of them, Lydia is probably the first to succumb, who also likely does end up slipping into unconsciousness and dying. With severe head trauma, Kolya probably came right after. And Sasha was the only one Klevetov believed could still be saved. He was likely alive when he got back, but was pretty much knocking on death's door. Due to him running to Georgi and Doroshenko, cutting away their clothes, rearranging their bodies, and running back to the ravine, Klevetov overexerted himself. Combine that with the onset of hypothermia, he soon collapsed right next to Sasha. Now, either seeking comfort or warmth or both, Klevetov embraced Sasha on the ground, and together both of them ended up succumbing to their injuries and the harsh elements. Lastly, we have Igor, Rustic, and Zena, who were the closest to the tent, but likely lost each other in their panic. Consequently, these three probably succumbed to the elements relatively quickly. Igor attempted to find cover in the tree line before eventually collapsing. Similarly, Rustic and Xena wandered blindly in the Siberian forest before collapsing and succumbing to the cold. More than likely, there wasn't a single member of the expedition alive when the morning came on February 2nd. 5 of them would lie there in the snow for nearly a month, while the remaining 4 would sit undiscovered for 3 months. Even if this is the most likely way these events happened, there are a number of huge unanswered questions, but mostly, why would this experienced group flee from their only source of protection, and what caused the severe trauma experienced by these hikers? Given the mystery and brutality of this case, there have been multiple theories for what possibly happened on that mountain. So, right now we're going to cover the most popular theories, and I'll talk about which one I believe is the most likely when I get to my conclusion. So, the most widely accepted theory suggests that the group was caught in an avalanche. Now, at first, I found this explanation impossible, but upon closer examination, certain elements do align with this theory. First, you got to consider the tent's location. While setting up on a slope is not inherently perilous, it's not recommended for the potential of possibly triggering an avalanche when placing tent supports in the snow. However, if you think the snow is stable enough, as Dyatlov may have felt, setting up on a slope could seem reasonable. But let's say that it wasn't safe, so possibly by them placing the tent on the slope began a disruption that eventually led to an avalanche. The first thing that would have set the panic in motion would likely be the sound. Avalanches are ungodly loud, but they are also very fast. In reality, if the avalanche occurred on that mountain, the group would have had literally seconds to react to the sound of the avalanche before it hit their tent. Now, before we delve into the moment of contact with the tent, I want to clarify what type of avalanche is often associated with the Dyatlov case, which is a slab avalanche. Now, unlike the typical rolling plume of snow that we see in an avalanche, a slab of avalanche involves exactly that. It is a slab of ice and snow that breaks away from the mountain and just goes flying down the mountain. Imagine this scenario. All 9 members of the group are sound asleep in the tent when they are suddenly awoken by a thunderous sound that is rapidly approaching them. Before they can react, the tent is struck by this extremely heavy, dense slab of snow and ice. Ludia, Sasha, and Kolya are all impacted full force by this slab. And in the fear of the possibility of a worsening avalanche, the group starts to panic, with the entrance either blocked by parts of the slab or it proving too difficult to open. In their panic, they resort to cutting their way out of the tent. Given their experience, they understand that finding flat ground, particularly in the nearby forest, improves their chances of safety from an avalanche. But in this panic, the group made a critical mistake when they split up. Once in the forest, they found themselves in separate groups. Had they stayed together, there might have been a chance for a majority of the group to survive. Although the duration of this survival remains pretty uncertain, but probably not great. What's indisputable is that Ludia, Kolya, and Sasha would not have survived even if they had remained with the group. As I said earlier, Igor, Xena, and a few of the others were positioned as if they had collapsed while trying to return to the tent. If 1 or 2 of them had managed to reach the tent and gather supplies, they likely would have at least survived the night of the first. However, without the tent or sufficient shelter, they still wouldn't have been able to survive until the search party arrived nearly a month later. Now, the next theory is that the group fell victim to katabatic winds. These are a specific type of wind that only occur when a specific condition is met. Now, I'm not a meteorologist, so when I tried to understand what these conditions were, I still had no idea what they meant. From the little bits that I did understand, katabatic winds occur when the air on a mountain is a certain density and gravity pulls that high density air towards the lower denser air at the bottom of a mountain. When this happens, these winds can reach speeds of over 150 miles per hour. However, those speeds are the more intense variety of katabatic winds. Typically, these winds don't reach more than 15 miles per hour or so. According to researchers, the section of the Urals that the tent was set up on does have the possibility to produce these winds. Now, if these winds were the more intense variety, the tent would have been getting slammed by 100+ mile per hour winds. Maybe if they were fearing that their tent would collapse or something to that extent, the events would then unfold the way we know they did. That obviously leaves a ton of unanswered questions, but like I said earlier, those unanswered questions are why this mystery is still talked about. And as we continue throughout the rest of these possible explanations, just remember that every explanation leaves some things completely unanswered. Now, this one, I'm not even going to pretend to understand how it happens, but according to people much smarter than me, it does happen, so that's good enough for me. So, a Kármán vortex street is a type of phenomenon that occurs when strong winds collide with a blunt object like a mountain or large rock, and those winds basically turn into mini tornadoes. Now, these tornadoes very rarely develop enough to physically damage anything, but it's what they produce that we're more interested in. When these mini tornadoes are formed, they produce something called infrasound. Infrasound, or low frequency sound, consists of sound waves with frequencies too low for human detection. Various natural phenomena, such as earthquakes and volcanoes, emit infrasound, and there are actually monitoring stations worldwide that are dedicated to scanning these low frequency signals emitted by earthquakes and volcanoes. Tornadoes have also been known to occasionally emit infrasound frequency. So the theory is basically that these Kármán vortexes are formed, and once these little mini tornadoes start forming, they start putting off infrasound. Okay, well, so then what does infrasound mean in the realm of the Dyatlov Pass incident? Well, according to some studies, infrasound has been shown to negatively impact humans at a subconscious level. So while we can't physically hear these frequencies, our mind does still detect them on a subconscious level. Some negative effects that are believed to be byproducts of prolonged exposure to infrasound are migraines, sleep trouble, agitation, nausea, general uneasiness, anxiety, fear, and breathing trouble. Additionally, some reports claim that it can almost make someone's body feel as if it's vibrating. So if you take those subconscious responses and then also factor in that they're possibly getting hit by these little mini tornadoes, you have quite a horrifying experience. So the group, who would have had no way to understand what they were truly experiencing, would have felt like they were in a truly life-threatening situation. Then, as we know, they cut through the tent, and by now we know what happens next. Now, taking a step outside the natural phenomena explanations, we have a theory that in some way or another, the hikers fell victim to some sort of military or weapons testing. This was 1959. The Cold War was ongoing, and the idea that there could have been some sort of top-secret weapons being tested was and still is not far-fetched. Remember earlier we spoke about the orbs the Dyatlov group and others may have seen in the sky over the Urals? Well, some believe those orbs were a type of weapon or rocket that the group would have been completely unaware of. Also, as you remember, some of the original investigators pointed toward meteorological devices to explain these orbs. So the idea is that the group witnessed a meteorological rocket, got spooked, and then that's what started the chain of events. Or, alternatively, the group fell victim to some sort of weapon being tested by the military, and either purposefully or accidentally, the group died as a result of this weapon. Now, both of these theories could be used to explain the authorities and the KGB's very odd behavior and reluctance to look into the case. So, the next theory is that the theory that the group was attacked and then murdered by other people on the mountain. The first people to usually be blamed for this are the Mansi. Now, like I said, I was going to try to wait until my conclusion to explain which theories I do and do not believe and why, but this theory I kind of want to discuss now. I, under every circumstance, do not believe that the group was attacked by anybody. Now, this goes doubly for when we're talking about the Mansi. Firstly, The closest Mansi tribe was miles away from the tent and the hikers' final resting places. Some theories suggest that the hikers were murdered due to trespassing in what was believed to be sacred Mansi territory. However, by all accounts, this was not part of the Mansi sacred land. I know I keep saying Mansi and Mansi. I think it's either. So just, I can hear myself saying it differently, so I know. But this was not part of the Mansi's sacred land, and they would rarely even travel to this part of the Urals because there wasn't sufficient enough game to justify hunting there. Lastly, the Mansi were known for their peaceful nature and were extremely helpful during the search for the group. Now, while I'm very adamant about the fact that the Mansi had nothing to do with the hikers' deaths, I also don't think any other person or persons had anything to do with their deaths either. There are theories that the group was attacked by a group of criminals that followed them from one of the labor camps that they stopped at. Others theorize that they were rounded up by the Russian military, the KGB, and were murdered by them. Neither of these theories make any sense for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the injuries sustained by the final three hikers were considered way too intense and damaging to even be caused by a human. Additionally, there was no evidence that anyone was on the mountain besides those three hikers. With a mystery as big as this that went completely unanswered, some would start to look towards more drastic explanations. So, of course, I'm talking about the paranormal. Now, when people speak about this incident and its possible connection to the supernatural, two theories are brought up the most. Firstly, we have the alien UFO theory. I know a lot of people will roll their eyes at this because aliens get blamed for everything that goes unexplained. And when I began the research for this video, I felt entirely the same way when I had to read about UFO and alien stuff for this. However, after all of it, there is just enough in this story to kind of justify mentioning this theory. The biggest piece of evidence for this theory is the orbs that have been reported on the mountain. So instead of those being meteorological rockets or something to that degree, those orbs may be something of unknown origin. Also, you have that photo we looked at earlier where there is this light trail creeping up to the left side of the frame that has no explanation and was one of the last photos the group took. On top of that, you have the radiation found on some of the clothes, which I haven't really spoke about up until this point, but we'll definitely talk about in my conclusion. So maybe if the group came into contact with a ship or device of alien origin, perhaps that is what irradiated their clothes. This could also explain the odd behavior from the authorities. The next big paranormal theory we have is one that I've always loved with this case, and that is the Yeti theory. The Yeti, or the abominable snowman, is essentially a variety of Bigfoot or Sasquatch that are typically found in snowy regions like the Himalayan mountains, or, you guessed it, the frozen mountain ranges of Siberia. If you are interested in cryptozoology or even just Bigfoot, you'll know that most of the time, and the traditional description of Sasquatch, is that they are somewhat peaceful creatures unless you give them a reason not to be. So, while they do have the capability to inflict damage on humans if they so wished, they seem to act like a lot of animals and simply just want nothing to do with us. Now, the Yeti is a little different. These creatures are believed to display more aggressive behavior and are actually described as carnivorous. So if you take their aggressive nature, supposed nature, you could theorize that the group may have accidentally stumbled into the Yeti's territory and been attacked because of that. Or, more horrifyingly, since it's carnivorous, the group was being hunted for this creature's next meal. What if they were awoken by the sound of a giant creature approaching their tent, and as it gets closer, they become more anxious before the beast is right on top of them? Feeling that obviously this could only end badly, the group tries to escape. They flee to the nearby woods, knowing that it's their only source of cover in the tundra, but unfortunately, 3 of the hikers couldn't escape the creature. The Yeti brutally attacks them, leaving them with severe internal bleeding, and going as far as gouging their eyes out and even ripping the tongue out of one of the hikers. Subsequently, the remainder of the group succumbed to the elements without a means of shelter. This would also provide some explanation for the authorities' behavior and the severe injuries some of the hikers experienced. After all of this, what do I think caused the Dyatlov Pass incident? Well, in my opinion, an avalanche is the most likely culprit for what happened on the night of February 1st, 1959. Now, if you've been on my channel for a while, that might be kind of a surprising conclusion for me, of all people, to have. And honestly, I did believe for years there had to be something paranormal or supernatural responsible for these hikers' deaths. However, in my research for this video and my general interest in this case over the years, I found that an avalanche checks a majority of the boxes for this case and just makes too much sense. As I said earlier, I think the tents setting on that mountain slope set this avalanche in motion. In the early morning hours of February 2nd, a slab broke off from the top of the mountain, then began shooting down the mountain. Like I said, it would be very loud if this happened, which would wake the group up. However, again, like I said, this slab would have been traveling so fast that they'd have no time to react to it before it collided with the tent. When it collided with the tent, it struck Lydia, Kolya, and Sasha inside the tent. It probably also struck a couple of the others, but not with as much force as the other three, which could be why there was some tissue damage and scarring on some of the other bodies that was of way less extent than the three that really got hit by it. Secondly, I want to talk about this too. When a slab from a slab avalanche collides with something solid, it tends to crumble into little pieces, which could explain the snow you see on top of the collapsed tent in the photos from the investigation. So, after they're struck, the group panics, believing that they are about to be trapped by an avalanche, so they believe it would take too long to undo the entrance, so they physically cut their way out of the tent as quickly as possible. With their experience and knowledge, they would know the flat ground would be best, and the wooded area would also be the best, but as I said earlier, they made a huge mistake when they split up. As we know, Georgy and Doroshenko die under the tree on the edge of the woods. Igor, Rustic, and Zina all perish while trying to make their way back to the tent. And the ravine is kind of where things start to get a little interesting. After they leave the tent, Lydia, Kolya, and Sasha are running on adrenaline alone. Now, Klevetov managed to stay with these three, knowing that they were in very critical condition. Unfortunately, the group runs into the ravine, which is essentially a nail in the coffin for the three that are injured. Klevetov knows if he doesn't intervene, all three of them are going to die. Like I said, he doesn't know the extent that they're injured to. They were all going to die anyways, but his thinking was that, I can still save these people, and if I don't intervene, they'll all die. So he then finds Georgy and Doroshenko, cuts away parts of their clothing, and uses those on the injured survivors. But when he gets back to the ravine, he realizes he's already too late. He uses the parts he gathered to give some extra warmth, but by now all of them, except for maybe Sasha, are dead. And lastly, like I said, in desperation, Klevetov hugs the body of Sasha and lies there until he too succumbs to hypothermia. Of course, this still leaves some unanswered questions, or does it? So what about the radiation? The hikers missing their eyes, Lydia missing her tongue, and the KGB and authorities' odd behavior. Well, in all actuality, the avalanche doesn't need to answer any of these questions. Let me explain what I mean, though. Let's start with the radiation. The radiation aspect has to be one of the most exaggerated parts of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Many people tend to hone in on this as proof that something either supernatural happened or they were the victims of weapons testing. The truth, however, and what is likely, is pretty underwhelming in actuality. In 1957, 2 years before the Dyatlov expedition, in the territory of Chelyabinsk Oblast, the third worst nuclear disaster in history took place. Known as the Kishtim disaster, an improperly stored tank of nuclear waste at the Mayak nuclear facility exploded, which contaminated thousands of kilometers of land near the Urals. After this, the contaminated zone was referred to as the Eastern Ural Radioactive Trace, or YURT. The affected zone included the territory of Sverdlovsk, the home of multiple hikers in the expedition. However, there is one of the hikers we need to look at specifically, that being Georgy Kravchenko. At the time of the disaster, Georgy was employed at the Mayak facility. Then, after the disaster, he was part of the cleanup crew sent to the facility. I don't really think it'd be a stretch to say that the regulations on radioactivity were a lot more relaxed or outright ignored in 1959 more than they are today. After his time in and around the facility, Georgy's clothes, and honestly, he himself, would have been abnormally radioactive. So, if the theory I laid out of the avalanche is correct, when Klivetov cut the pieces of fabric from Georgy's body and then placed them on two of the others that were injured, because if you remember, not every member was tested for radioactivity, just the 4 that were found in the ravine, that could explain why 2 of those hikers' clothes had abnormal radioactivity on their clothes. This also explains the statement by one of the investigators that said the levels that were observed were higher than those of people who worked in nuclear facilities. So not only did Georgy work in one of those facilities, but he was also tasked with cleaning up remnants of a nuclear disaster at that facility. That even explains the KGB and the authorities' behaviors around the event. When the disaster happened, there was a massive cover-up effort by the Russian government. It's possible that once the Russian government got wind of Georgy's death, they connected his name to the disaster, and then they began to suppress this story. Then, the radiological tests are performed, and pieces of his clothing come back as having abnormal levels of radiation, and that's when they come down even harder on this case. Okay, so now that we have a decent grasp on the radiation and the odd behavior by the authorities, we need to discuss the more bizarre injuries sustained by the hikers. Those two have a rather anticlimactic explanation. Let's talk about the big ones first, and the ones that are about as overhyped and overexaggerated as the radiation aspect. Those are the removal of the eyes and the removal of Ludia's tongue. Also, real quick, I just want to say, I know I'm saying things like exaggerated and overhyped, but I'm not saying these things to undermine this case or to insult anyone that has a different opinion on the case. The eyeball thing and the tongue missing used to be proof enough for me that something bigger had to be going on. However, once you kind of get into the research of this case, you quickly find that there's quite a bit of misinformation and misunderstanding about this case. For example, I'd always heard that there was blood found in Ludia's stomach, which would have meant that she was alive when her tongue was removed. But I could not find a single source that could verify this information. If I had to wager a guess, someone heard that Ludia was missing her tongue and had severe internal hemorrhaging and went, wow, wouldn't it be terrifying if she was alive when she experienced this? And yeah, it would be terrifying, but it's probably not true. But that set off everything. If the tongue was removed while she was alive, maybe the group members who were missing their eyes experienced that while they were alive too. Except neither the tongue nor the eyes make any sense to have been removed before they were dead. If they were attacked by a man or beast, yeti, whatever, you would expect the eyes to be gouged out. They weren't. The sockets were just empty. So what do I think happened then? Scavengers. Small animals. That's what I think. That's what I think happened. I think a lot of people get confused when they hear the name Dead Mountain. As I said, the Manzi called it Dead Mountain because there wasn't enough game worth hunting on the mountain. But that doesn't mean the mountain was completely void of wildlife. The Urals are host to several small carnivorous and omnivorous animals like squirrels, chipmunks, foxes, badgers, and a whole host of small scavenging birds. And, while it may be gross, carnivorous animals will go for soft tissue first, because it's the easiest to access and the easiest for them to consume. I think that pretty well confirms and covers the missing eyes and tongues, But what about the dark complexion witnesses reported on the bodies? Decomposition. When humans go through decomposition, the second step of that process is livor mortis. Since your heart no longer pumps blood, the blood in your body will fall victim to gravity. So over time, your blood will sink to the part of your body closest to the ground. And then when the blood does start to move its way down, it kind of pools together. And when it does, these pools appear as dark purple spots on the skin. Now, typically it takes only 6 to 8 hours for the blood to completely pool at the lowest point of the body, unless your body is placed somewhere that has an extreme temperature. If you're somewhere that's hot, decomposition accelerates, and if you're somewhere cold, decomposition slows. Somewhere like the sub-zero Siberian tundra would drastically slow the rate of decomposition. That would explain the dark purple complexion of the first 5 bodies. But as for the additional 4, they were on that mountain for 3 months, meaning they were already well within the stages of decomposition. The last thing I want to talk about before I share my final thoughts is the opinion of Yuri Yudin. As we know, Yuri Yudin, who turned back due to his rheumatism, turned out to be the only survivor of the expedition. Having tragically lost 9 of his closest friends, what did he think happened? Well, somewhat surprisingly, he was a proponent of the idea that there was a conspiracy or cover-up about the case. Specifically, he opted into the theory that the military or the KGB had killed his friends. When he was asked why they would kill the group, Yuri theorized that the group may have accidentally trespassed onto a military zone. The military then he thinks the military ordered the group out of the tent and forced them to destroy their own tent to confuse future investigators. They then separated the members into small groups, dragged them out to different parts of the nearby forest, and in some way or another led them to their deaths. Then Yuri Yudin passed away on April 27th, 2013 at 76 years old, holding firm that someone had led to the deaths of his friends on that mountain. Oh, so with that, I believe we've covered every major point of this story. I'm almost positive there are little bits and pieces that I did miss, but that kind of just shows how extensive this case is.
So in addition to me probably missing some of the smaller details, I ended up missing some of the larger ones as well. Specifically, I completely forgot to go over why I didn't think any of the other theories were as likely as an avalanche. Besides an avalanche, the other theory that gets brought up the most to explain the incident is the Kármán vortexes and the infrasound that they produce. While researchers believed that Dead Mountain could produce these vortexes, it has never been 100% confirmed. Therefore, if the mountain has never been confirmed to create these vortexes, we can't confirm whether or not they even were caught in one of these mini tornadoes and fell victim to that infrasound they produce. As for the katabatic winds, I don't think it makes any sense that these experienced hikers would fall victim to high winds. They knew the Urals and they knew how to handle high winds, so even if they did panic, imagine if they even did panic about the winds, why would they not layer themselves before leaving the tent? Also, clearly the winds weren't strong enough to even knock down the supports of the tent, so it's hard for me to believe that they would panic thinking their tent was going to collapse on them. In terms of weapons testing, I don't think it makes any sense that only 3 of the hikers suffered severe injuries, while the others succumbed to hypothermia. Since we know all of the hikers left the tent at the same time, if the group was running after being hit by some type of weapon, how were only 3 of the hikers affected? I already covered why I believed they weren't attacking and or killed by other people, so the last thing I want to cover are the paranormal theories. As for the UFO theory, there is little evidence to point towards that explanation. Like I said earlier in the video, there is just enough to bring up this theory, but the argument for it isn't very strong. Outside of the odd photo of the light trail and the radiation, there isn't much to go on. But, again, since the case is mysterious and still unexplained, it's still easy for some to just fall on the paranormal, especially UFOs and aliens, to provide an explanation for the events. Lastly, we have the Yeti. And much like the UFOs, the Yeti has just enough to consider the theory. First and foremost, the severe trauma suffered by the last three hikers, as discussed, were far too intense to be caused by another person. So maybe those injuries were caused by a mythical beast. However, there is another piece of evidence some view as proof of the Yeti's involvement. The last photo in Zena's camera shows a humanoid-like figure stepping out from behind a tree and seemingly following the group through the forest. For years, this was my and many others' smoking gun for the case when it came to the Yeti theory. However, if you go back through the films recovered from the cameras, you'll see that Kolya is likely what was captured in that last photo. The gear Kolya was wearing was all black, and on top of that, since these hikers were wearing multiple layers and were walking in knee-high snow, they all had weird postures and walking styles, so likely Xena just turned around to document Kolya hiking for their certification. After all that, the last thing I want to talk about is when exactly Dyatlov Pass became Dyatlov Pass. In actuality, the current day Dyatlov Pass is over a mile away from Dead Mountain where they, died. Now, as for when exactly the pass was renamed after the incident is something I'm not completely sure of because I couldn't personally find information about a date of when this name change happened. But to this day, the pass is still a popular hiking destination in present-day Russia.
Still, I do believe an avalanche is the most likely explanation for this case. And, to kind of add to my confidence about it, nearly every time that this case has been reopened and investigated, the consensus is that an avalanche led to the Dyatlov Pass incident. And also, in 2020, the official causation was determined to be an avalanche. However, I am aware that people have some very strong beliefs about this case. So, if you're one of those people and you have a different opinion, let me know in the comments, or you can also call me an idiot for thinking it's an avalanche. It doesn't really matter to me. So, because this is why this case continues to be so popular and so special more than 65 years after it happened. Because it will never fully be solved. Everything is speculation about it. And all that speculation is built on very limited information. Even as confident as I am that an avalanche was the cause, I nor anyone can prove it 100%. The only people that know what happened on that mountain perished on it. I mean, unless they were attacked by aliens or the Yeti, which, by the way, yeah, I wasn't kidding earlier. I used to be a huge believer in the Yeti theory, and while I don't believe it now, I do like the story. But, in all seriousness, 9 bright young adults with long lives ahead of them tragically died while doing what they loved. So, while we can speak and theorize about the mystery, we shouldn't forget the 9 people who lost their lives to an unknown compelling force. Wow, this video ended up a lot more in-depth than I ever intended it to be. But if you couldn't tell, I really like this story. It's one of those cases I've been super obsessed with ever since I first heard about it. And, I can't remember the first time I ever heard it or saw it. But it had to be many years ago at this point. I probably heard this story before I ever really got too interested in paranormal stuff. Because I don't even remember when I heard about this, really. But I do really like this story, and almost everything that comes out about it, whether that be like documentaries or other YouTubers that do stuff similar to me, whenever there's a new video on it, I always watch it. Whenever there's new stuff about it, I always read about it. But yeah, it's just starting to lose my voice now because this was a long one. Overall, the Ouija was still a lot longer in total for the 3 parts, but this has been my longest single video outline for a video I've done so far. I have a feeling I have a strong feeling that's not going to stay that way, but I do really like this story. And it's one that when I started my channel, I knew I was going to have to talk about eventually. But I wasn't kidding earlier. I know I kind of joked about it, but if you do have different opinion on this than the Avalanche that I do, please let me know, because I like hearing people's theories about this stuff. I can't get enough of this story. It is very haunting. There was quite a few times in the story that it did genuinely make me sad reading about it, because the case has kind of become larger than the people that were in it. Like, the mystery of what happened to these people has become more important in I don't want to say, I'm trying to think of what I'm saying here. Like, people only look at the mystery aspect of this story, but there was still 9 people who died under very mysterious circumstances. And I don't think that should be forgotten. Like, I tried to make that pretty obvious in this, that I'm like, I love talking about this, but these 9 people still did die. And while it's interesting to theorize about what happened to them, I don't think it should be forgotten that that's what happened, is that at the root of all of it is 9 people that died under very mysterious circumstances. But like I said, I do get it, because it is fun to talk about the mystery, but we got to remember the 9 people that died from it too. But besides that, I don't think I have too much to say. I think I've made my points very clear in this video. At least I hope so. I think I did. If you enjoyed it, or if you enjoyed my cat coming in here earlier in the video and then leaving me, let me know. Anything you all want to comment about the video, any improvements, any critiques, anything like that, please let me know. Also, if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, it really helps me out. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Thank you all for the continued support. I wasn't expecting another 3-month break in between my last video, but like I said, I got a bit carried away with this one. And it was actually going to end up being bigger than this, but I'm just taking it one step at a time. I don't want to overthink what I do here, because I do love doing this stuff, and I'm glad to finally have you all on your video. But once again, thank you all for the continued support. If you're here, thank you for making it this far into the video, and I hope to see you all soon. And hopefully, when I say see you all soon, I mean earlier than 2 or 3 months from now. So yeah, thank you all for watching.